Boy gets on bus, driver looks at his feet, immediately calls 911. At first glance, the little boy seemed like any other passenger. But when the driver saw his feet, those tiny red shoes, his pulse quickened. He knew he was staring at a face from the morning's news. Tim Watson had driven the same bus route for over 15 years. Day in and day out, he navigated the bustling streets of San Francisco, weaving through the city's chaos with the ease that only comes from experience. To most people, being a bus driver was just another job, but to Tim, it was more than that. It was a way of life, a chance to connect with people, to witness snippets of their daily struggles and triumphs. His passengers weren't just commuters. They were familiar faces with stories, quirks, and routines. At 45, Tim had seen it all. The morning rush filled with caffeine-fueled professionals glued to their phones, the elderly clutching grocery bags with a quiet grace, and the teenagers with their oversized headphones, lost in their own worlds. But what he cherished most were the unexpected moments of kindness. Helping a lost tourist find their way, comforting an anxious mother struggling with a stroller, or simply offering a warm smile to someone who needed it. At home, he was a devoted husband and father of two, a doting dad who never missed a soccer game or a bedtime story. His wife, Laura, often joked that he had an uncanny sixth sense for trouble, a skill honed from years behind the wheel and countless encounters with the unpredictable. And that morning, as he set out on his route, something in his gut told him this wouldn't be just another day. It started like any other Tuesday morning. Crisp air, the distant hum of the city awakening, and a golden sunrise creeping over the horizon. But there was something different today. Tim couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the wind whispered through the towering buildings, or perhaps it was the eerie stillness that hung in the air despite the usual rush-hour clamor. As he turned on the radio, the voice of a local news anchor cut through the static. Breaking news this morning. San Francisco police are on high alert after the abduction of a 3-year-old boy from the downtown library. The child, last seen wearing a blue shirt, plaid shorts, and red Crocs, is believed to be with an unidentified male suspect. Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward immediately. Tim's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, his mind registering the details. He had kids of his own. The thought of a missing child sent an unsettling shiver down his spine, but he pushed it aside. After all, the city was vast, and what were the odds that... Then it happened. At a routine stop near the library district, a man and a young boy stepped onto the bus. Instantly, Tim's instincts kicked in. The boy, no older than 3 or 4, clung to the man's side, his small face tear-streaked, his tiny shoulders trembling under his blue shirt. His plaid shorts looked slightly wrinkled, and on his feet, Tim's eyes lingered for just a second too long, were bright red Crocs. Tim felt his heartbeat quicken. Could it be? The man, wearing a worn-out baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, barely acknowledged anyone as he shoved a handful of crumpled bills into the fare box. His posture was stiff, his movements deliberate but tense. He ushered the boy to an empty seat near the back of the bus, his grip on the child's wrist just a little too tight. Tim glanced at the boy through the rearview mirror, their eyes meeting for a split second. There it was, fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. His mind raced. Was this just a tired father dealing with an upset child? Or was he witnessing something far more sinister? Tim knew one thing for certain. He couldn't ignore it. He needed to act, but he also needed to be smart. One wrong move, and things could spiral out of control. Taking a deep breath, he kept driving, his thoughts swirling with one question. How do I confirm it without tipping him off? Tim's hands rested on the wheel, but his mind was far from the familiar route. He had always been an observant man. 15 years behind the wheel had sharpened his senses. He could tell when someone was having a rough morning, when a couple was fighting quietly in the back seats, or when a tourist was overwhelmed by the city's chaos. But this was different. The little boy sat stiffly beside the man, his shoulders hunched, his wide eyes brimming with unshed tears. Something about the way he gripped the edge of his seat, his tiny fingers trembling against the worn fabric, made Tim's stomach twist into knots. He had seen children cry before, tantrums, scraped knees, lost toys, but this was different. This was fear, a silent, paralyzing kind of fear. Tim's eyes flickered to the man sitting next to the boy. He was dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. He barely looked up, staring straight ahead, his hand resting firmly on the boy's wrist. Not a comforting touch. Not a protective grip. No, this was something else. And then it clicked. Tim's mind flashed back to the morning news bulletin he had half listened to while sipping his coffee. A missing child, taken from a library downtown. 3 years old. Blue shirt. Plaid shorts. Red Crocs. Tim's gaze dropped to the child's feet. And there they were. The bright red shoes. Slightly scuffed but unmistakable. His throat tightened. What are the odds? A dozen thoughts raced through his mind. Was it just a coincidence? Could it be someone else? But the way the boy sat, silent, anxious, too still, told him all he needed to know. Instinct screamed at him to do something. But what? If he acted too soon, the man might panic. If he was wrong, he'd just accused an innocent man of a horrific crime. But if he was right, there was no time to waste. Tim took a slow, deep breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the dashboard. He needed to be smart, careful. He couldn't let the suspect know he was onto him. Years of dealing with difficult passengers and unexpected situations had given Tim a quick-thinking edge. He needed an excuse, something to move closer, to confirm what his gut was already screaming at him. Grabbing the intercom microphone, he spoke in his usual calm, steady tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, someone has reported a missing green backpack. I'm going to walk through and check if it's been left on board. Please take a look around your seats." It was a simple announcement, nothing unusual. Passengers barely looked up, accustomed to such routine messages. But Tim's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up and started down the aisle, scanning carefully, making it look like he was doing his job. As he walked past the suspect and the boy, he slowed slightly, pretending to check under his seat. His eyes darted quickly to the boy's lap. There it was, a blue shirt, plaid shorts, and those haunting red Crocs. His pulse spiked. "It's him." The child blinked up at him, his lips slightly parted as if he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. His gaze flickered to the man beside him, and Tim noticed how the man's grip on the boy's wrist tightened ever so slightly. The man's eyes met Tim's for the briefest moment. Dark, cautious, assessing. Tim forced a smile, giving a slight nod before moving down the aisle, pretending to keep searching. Inside, he was screaming. He wanted to snatch the boy right then and there, but he couldn't risk it. Reaching the back of the bus, Tim turned slowly and walked back to his seat, his mind racing with what to do next. He had to act fast but smart. Sliding back into the driver's seat, Tim reached for his phone, his hands clammy. He couldn't afford to let the suspect see him making a call, so he moved carefully, shielding the screen from view as he dialed 911. His voice was low, steady, but tinged with urgency. "This is Tim Watson, driver of bus number 257. I believe I have the missing child from the morning alert on board. Blue shirt, plaid shorts, red Crocs. He looks scared, and the man with him, he's acting off." The dispatcher's voice came through, crisp and calm. "Understood, Tim. Stay en route. Officers are en route to intercept at the next major stop." Tim nodded to himself, even though no one could see. "Got it. I'll keep driving like normal." "Do not engage the suspect," the dispatcher warned. "We need to ensure the child's safety first." "Understood," Tim said, slipping the phone back into its holder. His heart pounded as he glanced in the mirror again. The man was shifting uneasily now, his gaze darting toward the front of the bus. Had he noticed something? Was he getting suspicious? Tim swallowed hard and forced himself to keep driving. The next stop wasn't far. He just had to hold it together a little longer. As the bus rolled forward, Tim noticed the man's body language shifting. His shoulders hunched forward, his eyes flickering around the bus, as if he was suddenly aware of his surroundings. His foot tapped restlessly against the floor, a nervous habit of someone who knew the walls were closing in. Tim kept his eyes on the road, but could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The man was growing more agitated by the second. Every now and then, he would lean down and whisper something to the boy, whose expression only grew more terrified with each passing moment. The boy's tiny hands gripped the edge of his seat so tightly that his knuckles turned white. At one point, he looked up at Tim through the mirror, eyes pleading, desperate. Tim swallowed the lump in his throat. Minutes felt like hours. The next stop was coming up, and Tim could see the flashing lights of police cars in the distance. Relief mixed with anxiety. This had to go perfectly. Then, out of nowhere, the man stood up. Tim's stomach dropped. Was he planning to get off early? His mind raced. He couldn't let that happen. Thinking fast, he grabbed the microphone again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some slight mechanical issues, so we'll be making a brief stop for safety checks. Please remain seated. A few passengers groaned, but Tim could see it worked. The man hesitated, shifting his weight, eyes scanning for another way out. Seconds stretched into eternity as the bus slowed to a stop. And then the doors opened. Before the man could take another step, uniformed officers swarmed the entrance, their presence filling the bus with authority. "Sir, step away from the child," one officer commanded, their voice leaving no room for argument. The boy whimpered, shrinking back as the officers quickly moved to separate him from the man. Within seconds, handcuffs clicked into place, and the nightmare was over. Tim sat frozen in his seat, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had done it. The boy was safe, and all because he trusted his gut. As Tim continued driving along his usual route, his mind raced. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on his chest, making every turn of the wheel feel monumental. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, locking onto the boy's small, trembling frame. "Stay calm. Just a little longer." The dispatcher's voice crackled softly through the receiver. "Tim, listen carefully. Officers are setting up at the next major stop. Keep driving as usual. Do not engage." "Got it," Tim muttered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. A few miles ahead, the police had turned the bus stop into a silent trap. Plainclothes officers blended into the early morning crowd, one pretending to read a newspaper, another leaning casually against a lamppost, and a third chatting with an unsuspecting pedestrian. Every move was carefully calculated, their gazes sharp and unwavering. In the distance, an unmarked police SUV idled, its engine humming softly, housing tactical officers who were ready to respond in an instant. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Every officer knew the risks involved. "Remember," the commanding officer's voice buzzed through their radios. "We wait for the driver's signal. No sudden movements." Back on the bus, Tim fought to keep his hands steady on the wheel. The suspect was beginning to grow uneasy. Tim could see it in the way he shifted, the way his eyes darted toward the passing street signs. He was calculating something, and Tim had to make sure he had no reason to bolt. The little boy was silent, his fingers clutching the edge of his seat like it was his lifeline. His small chest rose and fell in rapid breaths, his wide, fearful eyes glued to the front of the bus. Tim could feel the tension crackling in the air, each passing second stretching into an eternity. The next stop loomed closer. "Almost there. Hold on, kid." The bus finally approached the designated stop, the familiar hiss of the brakes slicing through the tense silence. Tim exhaled slowly, trying to control the tremble in his hands. His thumb hovered over the door switch, his mind racing. This was it, the moment everything had been leading to. With a practiced motion, he pressed the button, and the doors slid open with a soft swoosh. The suspect stood up abruptly, pulling the child with him. The boy stumbled, his tiny feet struggling to keep up. Tim felt his heart lurch. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The man hesitated, his gaze sweeping across the crowd outside. Something in his eyes shifted, suspicion creeping in. He took a half step back. And then, "Sir, step away from the child." A voice cut through the air like a blade. An officer, dressed in plain clothes, appeared at the entrance of the bus, his expression firm yet composed. The man froze, his grip tightening around the boy's wrist. His eyes darted wildly, scanning for an escape route. Tim's fingers hovered over the emergency alarm, ready to act if needed. "Sir, don't make this difficult." Another officer stepped onto the bus, his posture calm but authoritative. The suspect's jaw clenched, his body tensing as if considering his options. But within seconds, two officers moved in swiftly. "Let go of the boy." Before the man could react, hands clamped down on his arms, pulling him away from the child. The boy stumbled backward into the waiting arms of an officer, his tiny body trembling as he gasped for air. The suspect thrashed briefly, but the officers handled him with trained efficiency, pinning him down and securing him in handcuffs. His face twisted in frustration, but he said nothing, his eyes darting toward the crowd of onlookers outside the bus. The boy, now free from the man's grasp, burst into tears, his sobs filling the suddenly silent bus. He clung tightly to the officer, burying his face in the man's chest. Tim exhaled, his entire body sagging with relief. His eyes met the boy's for a brief second through the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear, relief, hope. Around him, the bus erupted in hushed whispers. Some passengers covered their mouths in shock. Others murmured prayers of gratitude. A woman near the front wiped tears from her eyes. "That poor child," she whispered. Tim sat frozen, the weight of the moment crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had done it. The boy was safe. Once the suspect was escorted off the bus, the little boy remained clinging to the officer, his tiny hands gripping tightly. Tim stood up and walked down the aisle, his legs feeling heavier than they ever had before. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, kneeling beside the child. "You're okay now. We got you." The boy looked up at him, his lip trembling. Slowly, he reached out, and Tim took his small hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You're safe," Tim whispered. Tears welled in Tim's eyes, but he blinked them back, trying to stay composed for the child's sake. The other passengers watched the scene with solemn expressions, their earlier frustrations over delays forgotten. Soon, the officers ushered the boy outside, where another police officer handed him a phone. Tim watched from the bus door as the boy held the phone to his ear. "Mommy!" The cry that escaped from the other end of the line was heart-wrenching. "Oh, my baby, my baby!" The mother's sobs could be heard even from the bus, and Tim felt his throat tighten. The boy whispered, "I'm okay, Mommy," his voice cracking. Passengers murmured softly among themselves. Some applauded quietly, while others wiped away silent tears. An older gentleman patted Tim on the shoulder. "You did good, son," he said. Tim nodded, overwhelmed by the moment. In the days that followed, Tim's story spread like wildfire. Local news stations hailed him as a hero, a man who trusted his instincts and saved a life. Social media was flooded with messages of gratitude and admiration. People recognized him on his routes, offering handshakes and heartfelt thanks. Despite the praise, Tim remained humble. "I was just doing my job," he said repeatedly. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was about instinct, about caring enough to act when others might not have noticed. At home, his wife Laura hugged him tightly. "You always said you had a gut feeling for things," she whispered. "And today, it saved a life." Tim smiled softly, holding her close. He looked over at his own 2 children, playing in the living room, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Tim reflected on the events of the day. He had made a difference, and while he would never consider himself a hero, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, it only takes one person to change the course of a life. What started as an ordinary morning bus route turned into a story that captured the hearts of millions. Within hours of the rescue, local news outlets were buzzing with the incredible tale of Tim Watson, the unassuming bus driver who had saved a missing child from the clutches of danger. News channels aired footage of the dramatic arrest, praising Tim's keen observation and quick thinking. Headlines read, "Everyday Hero. Bus driver saves kidnapped boy with a sharp eye and steady nerves. Guardian on wheels. How a routine ride became a life-saving mission. Trust your gut. A simple instinct that changed everything." Social media platforms exploded with admiration and gratitude. Parents across the country shared the story, many admitting they had never considered how much responsibility public service workers carried on their shoulders. The hashtag #ThankYouTim trended for days, with thousands of people praising his vigilance and kindness. Tim's face became familiar on television screens, but he remained as humble as ever. When asked by reporters how he felt about being called a hero, he simply shrugged and said, "I just did what any father would do." But for the boys' parents, Tim was more than just a bus driver. He was their guardian angel. A week later, the family visited the bus depot to personally thank him. The mother, eyes brimming with tears, hugged Tim tightly and whispered, "You gave us our son back. We'll never forget what you did." In a small, heartfelt ceremony, the local police department presented Tim with an official commendation, recognizing his bravery and his invaluable role in ensuring the child's safe return. The mayor's office also honored him with a Community Hero Award, a gesture that made Tim blush with humility. Despite all the accolades, Tim's biggest reward was seeing the boy safe, smiling, and back in his mother's arms. Before that fateful day, Tim had always been proud of his job, but he never realized just how much of a difference he could make. He began seeing his work in a new light. Each passenger was someone's child, parent, or friend. His quiet commitment to their safety now carried a deeper sense of purpose. His co-workers at the bus depot regarded him with newfound respect, often jokingly calling him Sheriff Watson. Some even started paying more attention to their own routes, taking mental notes of anything unusual, inspired by Tim's vigilance. Tim also became an advocate for public awareness, speaking at community events and school safety programs. He shared his story with fellow bus drivers, emphasizing the importance of staying alert and trusting their instincts. "There's a lot happening around us that we don't always see," he told his colleagues. "But if we just take a moment to look a little closer, we might be able to make a difference." The story even reached transportation departments across the country, prompting bus companies to introduce additional safety training focused on identifying potential threats and handling emergencies effectively. Tim's daily routine hadn't changed much. He still greeted passengers with his friendly smile and still enjoyed the simple pleasures of driving through the familiar city streets. But deep down, he knew he'd never look at his job the same way again. Tim's story served as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance and compassion in everyday life. It wasn't just about being a bus driver. It was about being part of a community that looked out for one another. Key takeaways from the incident. Trust your instincts. Tim's gut feeling was the first step in preventing a tragedy. It highlighted the importance of intuition and how crucial it is to listen to that inner voice when something feels off. The power of observation. Small details, a blue shirt, plaid shorts, red Crocs, made all the difference. Being aware of our surroundings and noticing anomalies can save lives. Act, but act smartly. Tim's clever thinking to stage a lost backpack search allowed him to gather information without alarming the suspect. The lesson? Intervene wisely, and always consider the safest course of action. Report suspicious behavior. The importance of promptly contacting authorities cannot be overstated. Tim didn't act alone. He worked with law enforcement to ensure the best possible outcome. Citizens should feel empowered to report concerns without fear of being wrong. The role of everyday heroes. Tim wasn't a trained officer or an investigator. He was an ordinary person who chose to step up when it mattered most. It proves that heroes walk among us, disguised as bus drivers, teachers, shopkeepers, and neighbors. In the weeks following the incident, a movement started to take shape. Parents, teachers, and community leaders began discussing ways to better protect children in public spaces. Local bus stations implemented new safety guidelines, including regular driver briefings on identifying suspicious behavior and working closely with authorities. Schools encourage parents to teach their children basic safety measures, such as recognizing trusted adults and knowing what to do if they ever feel unsafe. For Tim, the experience reaffirmed his belief that sometimes it's the quietest people, the ones simply doing their jobs, who make the biggest difference. As he continued driving his route, now with a sharper eye and a deeper sense of purpose, he hoped that his story would inspire others to stay vigilant, stay kind, and above all, stay ready to help when the world needed them most.